This is Judaism Unbound, episode 42, Aphrodite and the Rabbis. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofus.
And we are here today with Professor Burton Visotzky. He is the Nathan and Janet Appleman Professor of Midrash and Interreligious Studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He's the author of the recently released book, Aphrodite and the Rabbis, How the Jews Adapted Roman Culture to Create Judaism as We Know It. I read this book recently and was absolutely fascinated by it. The book is his 11th, so if you find that book as fascinating as I did, you will certainly have plenty of reading to catch up on. You may also know Professor Visotzky from his appearance about 20 years ago on Bill Moyer's PBS show, Genesis, A Living Conversation, which grew out of some seminars and discussions about the Bible, about the book of Genesis that he held at JTS before the show was created. We are so excited to welcome Professor Visotzky today. But before we jump into our interview with Professor Visotzky, we just wanted to note that if you include our interview last week with Yehuda Kurtzer, we are doing 6 episodes that in some way connect to the holiday of Hanukkah, or at least some of the material in those episodes connects to Hanukkah. We're hoping that our listeners will be able to take those ideas, along with the ideas that we're going to have on a special section of our website, which we will release in a couple of weeks. You can check it out by going to www.judaismunbound.com and check out the resources section. And there's going to be a section called Hanukkah Unbound there. You can right now look at some of our previous holiday sections where we're presenting a variety of alternative or supplementary material that people can use to work and play with the material and shape their holiday experiences in ways that are meaningful to them, in ways that are responsive to the ways that they think those holidays fit with our time, etc. And we're hoping that through these episodes, through those resources, we're going to start to be able to help people take some of the big ideas that we've been using in Judaism Unbound that we've been exploring and start to think very practically about how can we take some of those ideas and reshape some of the practices that we experience all the time. Hanukkah is certainly a Jewish practice that many Jews participate in, and we really hope that it might be the first ground upon which people will play around with that material. We just want to note briefly that for those who don't necessarily know all of the story of Hanukkah, you can check out the show notes for this week's episode where we'll have some links to some interesting websites where you can learn more about the traditional story of Hanukkah. One of the things that we think is going to come up in these episodes is that you may look with some skepticism about the traditional stories and some thought about whether they are really as central to the holiday as you may have thought. So we're looking forward to exploring that in the weeks ahead. And without further ado, we are going to welcome Professor Burton Visotzky to the show. Professor Visotzky, thanks so much for joining us. It's really a great thrill to have you.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks so much for doing this.
One of our listeners sent me the news that your recent book, Aphrodite and the Rabbis, had been published and said, I think this is something that you guys should be interested in. And sure enough, we were. And I'm wondering, just to get us started, if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book.
Well, first, I've been at the Jewish Theological Seminary now for 45 years. And so back when I came here in the 70s, the great professor of Talmud, the great teacher of rabbinics, was also very, very active in writing about Hellenism in Jewish Palestine, Greek in Jewish Palestine, and taking kind of the yeshiva world and reminding everyone that the rabbis didn't live in a vacuum, that they lived in a much broader world, a world that was Greek-speaking in the Roman East. And ultimately joined the faculty here, and on a sabbatical in the year 2007, I had the privilege of teaching at the Pontifical Gregorian University. The Gregorian is a Jesuit university. It's actually where Pope Francis went to school. And because it's a papal university, doors in Rome were open that otherwise are very much closed to tourists. And one of the sets of doors that was open, although admittedly we had to smear some people to, what do we say, bakshish, gratuities were given, but I was able to visit the Jewish catacombs in Rome, which was really a remarkable experience for me. Many, many people have visited the Christian catacombs, and the city of Rome and the Vatican actually supports the Christian catacombs. So they've been cleaned up, they've been well ventilated, they have good lighting, and people go and visit all the time. But there are catacombs both literally across the street from the Christian catacombs, and in the center of town, actually underneath one of Mussolini's villas, that are Jewish catacombs from the same period, which is to say from the late 1st century through about the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era. And because I was able to go and visit, I was able to see these catacombs where those Jews are buried. So they're really not ready for prime time. It's moist down there. It's not ventilated, so you feel like you have asthma even if you don't. My tour guide was literally the electrician who every month goes to check the wiring from the excavations just to make sure that there's not going to be a fire. So we put on these little miner's hats with a light wobbling in front of us and carried lanterns with us. And he said to me that I could either follow the wiring holding my hand on the wire or put my hand on the wall and follow along the wall. I thought it was kind of dopey to follow the wiring just in case there was a short. So I put my hand on the wall, only to realize that the stone was porous, which is actually why they excavated there, and it was very moist to the touch. It was kind of creepy. And I'm going along in the catacombs, and of course we come to the first set of graves, which are excavated into the wall. And unlike the Christian catacombs, where they're technically called kochs, where the koch is empty, in the Jewish catacombs, there's still skeletons. So I'm literally inside a grave of Jews who lived 1,500, 1,600 years ago. And as I'm walking and seeing the skeletons, I realized that next to each burial site, there is either quite literally graffiti, that's the technical term, writing on the wall, or there is a marble in-place inscription saying who's buried there. And I start reading. The inscriptions are all in Latin letters, so they were very easy to read. And they are either in Latin or in Greek. In fact, the only Hebrew I saw the entire time I was there was one word, shalom, which tells you something about these Jews. They didn't have a lot of Hebrew. They were Greek and Latin speakers. And I'm there, and I wanted to calm myself. And because I've been an academic all my life, I calm myself by reading. So again, I went back to inscriptions on the wall. I started reading. Here's so-and-so, the son of so-and-so. Here lies so-and-so, the daughter of so-and-so. One of the inscriptions was really interesting. So-and-so is dead. That's all there is. So, and I go, okay, interesting grave inscription. But then it dawned on me that these were actual graves, that these were headstones, as it were, for all these people, and that nobody had visited these graves for almost 1,500, 1,800 years. And there I was, a rabbi in this cemetery, and because I am a rabbi, I know how to recite the El Malei Rachamim. And from somewhere really deep inside me, it kind of bubbled up. It's like, it was really genuinely a spiritual experience for me. And I started singing, El Malei Rachamim, Shochein Bamromim. And then I would fill in the name of each person in the grave. And I did this for one grave, and then the next grave, and then the next grave, and then the next grave. And it was just really an unbelievably moving experience. But I started thinking about who were these Jews that I was memorializing. And A, would they have understood the El Malei Rachamim? They didn't appear to know Hebrew. And B, I'm not sure that they would have agreed with rabbinic theology, which suggests that we have bodily resurrection of the dead. After all, I had read an inscription that said that's all there is. You live, you die, that's all there is. So I started to think really hard. What is the relationship between the Jews in Rome and the Jews that I know from rabbinic literature, the rabbis of the land of Israel? So I already knew that there was some influence in that Greek language had really penetrated the Talmud. We always think of the Talmud as a book that's in Hebrew and Aramaic, or I should say books that are in Hebrew and Aramaic. But there are somewhere upwards of 3,000, maybe 4,000 loanwords written out in Hebrew letters, but they're Greek terms. So I began to realize that there's just enormous penetration of Hellenistic thinking, of Greco-Roman thought, and Greco-Roman language that is found. My analogy would be, in Israel today. If you go to Israel today and you start sounding out signs, so eventually you're going to hit a sign that says televizia, or you'll see a sign that says computers, and A, these are not Hebrew words originally, too many letters, and B, I think it also shows the penetration of Western culture into Israeli society. So I came to realize that similarly, the rabbis of the Talmud and the Midrash were really influenced by Greek thought, by Greek language, by the modes and methods of Hellenism in philosophy, in law, in art, in architecture, all of those kinds of things. And that really is what drove me to write this book, what scholars have known for basically 70 years, since my professor Lieberman, may he rest in peace. I thought now I would try and write a book so that Jews out there, the people listening to this podcast, would have an opportunity to know the extent of foreign influence in shaping Judaism after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple.
Tell me if you sort of agree with this characterization of what happened, that the temple was destroyed and that way of being Jewish ended. And the process of kind of saying, well, what's next? I mean, it's interesting to connect it to that inscription on the catacomb, if death is the end and that's all there is, that would have been one way to go. But another way to go was to try to build something new out of it. And then the people who were doing that rebuilding, that they were part of this Greco-Roman culture. And so it naturally incorporated much of what they knew because they needed to have some source of material out of which to rebuild a new Judaism if much of the old one was gone and wasn't able to be useful anymore. Is that kind of the way that you see it?
I think you're right, Dan, that there's a real moment in history in the year 70 of the first century when, of all things, Rome destroyed the temple. But, of course, we have to remember that they destroyed the temple in reaction to a Jewish rebellion against the empire. But when they destroyed the temple, kind of everything we knew was in literally up in flames. When we read the Torah every week in the synagogue, sometimes we lose sight of the fact that the central book of the Torah is Leviticus. It's literally the middle. And it's all about animal sacrifices. But we don't do that anymore. The temple is gone. So Rome destroyed the temple, and yet Rome turned out to be the vehicle by which we could create something new, or at least an amalgam of the old biblical Judaism with a Western style. I think if I can draw an analogy, it's not unlike what happened after the Holocaust, right? It would have been possible, had Jewry only been European Jewry, to give it all up for lost. And I think there was a moment in 70, 80, 90 where the continuity of Judaism was up for grabs. It wasn't clear there would be Judaism. But like post-Holocaust, we Jews stepped up to the moment. And Judaism now is really very comfortably Western, just as then rabbis decided, well, we don't have the temple anymore. We can't offer sacrifices anymore. We can't even get into Jerusalem anymore. We've mostly been exiled to the Galilee. What are we going to do? How are we going to find a way to have Jewish identity? What will it look like? So, of course, they invented what we call the synagogue. I point out to you that's a nice Greek word, synagoge, right? They decided they would have Jewish courts, and the Jewish courts, again, were called the Sanhedrin. Synedrion, a nice Greek word, was the name for the Roman Senate. They simply adopted a well-known Greek format to recreate a Jewish possibility. Now we wouldn't be in Jerusalem. We'd be in lots of different places in the synagogue. Now we wouldn't have the court of Jerusalem. We would have the Sanhedrin in every local community. Even today, when Jews go into the synagogue, and they're always surprised to hear this, if you get an aliyah, if you're called up to the Torah, you go up to the bima. What we call, they're on the bima, which is that raised platform where they read Torah from and the rabbi speaks from, and people go up for opening and closing the ark, all of that. But the truth is the term bima is also Greek. Most people don't know that. They think, isn't that Hebrew? but it's actually bema is a literal Greek term to mean the tribunal, the raised platform where the judge sits. So we ascend to that raised platform when we get an aliyah, when we ascend to the Torah. So synagogue, Sanhedrin, bema, that's just three examples, ready examples of not just the terminology, but the cultural influence of Hellenism in Rabbinic Judaism.
And in reading your book, two of the most striking dimensions for me as I read it were, one, you're showing how many of the rabbinic stories, including many of the ones that we're kind of most familiar with, are really modifications of sort of classical, largely Stoic philosophical traditions. But, we have these guys who are basically Stoic philosophers, and they're now bringing in Jewish material into a sort of Stoic philosophical tradition, as opposed to, I think, the directionality that we often think of, okay, well, maybe Judaism is going to import certain things from other cultures. But I almost see this as the flip side of that, where it's saying, no, in a deeply cultural way, we are Greco-Romans, we are Stoic philosophers, but we're going to now pull the Jewish material into that as much as we can and to sort of Judaize it. That was sort of one piece of the book that really struck me. And the other was just your analysis of the artwork in many early synagogues that had Greco-Roman material such as the zodiac on the mosaic floors, and even maybe so far as to depict the god Helios in the center, where you wouldn't expect to find a Roman god on the floor of a Jewish synagogue. It struck me that it's kind of like the modern analogy that people have to something like a Christmas tree, that you would never in a million years imagine that a Christmas tree would be put on the mosaic floor of a synagogue, because everybody would be sort of scandalized by it. And yet you could also imagine that somebody would say, oh, well, it's not a Christmas tree, it's just a evergreen tree, and we like that because it reminds us in the winter that there's still growth. Or you could make some argument that it's not a Christmas tree, but we know that it would be extremely controversial to do something like that, and yet we saw that in the floors of ancient synagogues.
Well, you've given a wonderful summary of the entire book. And in fact, the rabbis do present themselves as Hellenistic, as Greco-Roman philosophers. They, like everyone else in the empire, were very comfortable with the Stoic ethos. What does it mean to be Stoic? It doesn't just mean that you accept pain. It means that you get along, you go along, you try not to show anger. But a lot of rabbinic teachings, particularly those in Pirkei Avot, which many of us study, Pirkei Avot has lots of Stoic thoughts. What is the good way a man should cleave to? What is the way a man should avoid? Those are standard Stoic educational questions. So as philosophy, the rabbis are very comfortable within the broader empire. Indeed, we have evidence that the head of the rabbinic Jewish community sent his son up to Antioch to study with Libanius, who was the great teacher of rhetoric in the ancient world. And that son, no doubt about it, mingled there with pagans and with Christians. In other words, he wasn't simply some little yeshiva boy sitting narrowly in his ghetto. Quite the contrary, they were out and about in the world. The leadership of the Jewish community is depicted as having discourse with indeed the emperor, which sounds unimaginable until you think about, well, every year the White House has a Hanukkah party, and the leaders of the Jewish community not only go, but the White House itself becomes glatt kosher. So, it may not be an exact analogy, but I think that at a certain period of time, the rabbinic Jews became as comfortable in the Roman Empire as we are today in America. And it helped them flourish. It helped them teach Torah. I don't know that Rabbi Akiva ever did a podcast, but they used the modes that were so familiar to the people around them. And those included the modes of rhetoric, of storytelling, of narrative, and many of the stories that we know well have parallels indeed in Hellenistic literature. And I don't think we even have to wonder who borrowed from whom. That's not the essential as much as it is how, in a way, westernized the rabbis were. If they lived today, they'd all be like us, going to universities, being trained in Western modes of thought, and then bringing that to their Jewish identity as a mode of expression, of Jewish expression.
I love that you talked about how, Rabbi Akiva probably never went on a podcast. I agree with you pretty strongly. But what we do have is we have the famous Talmudic anecdote of Moses sort of traveling forward in time to Rabbi Akiva's classroom and being totally out of his element and not knowing what to do. So maybe one day we can have a story of Rabbi Akiva flashing forward to the present and sitting in on a podcast. We'll see. That could be a fun episode.
It's a point well taken, and I compliment you guys for doing this, that it is our obligation as Jewish educators, as Jews who are invested in our identity, that whatever the modern modes of discourse are, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a TV show, whether it's using Hellenistic rhetoric, we will do that to teach Torah, because the transmission of Jewish values is paramount, and the vehicle is whatever it takes. You talked about art. Art is also a vehicle for transmitting Jewish culture, whether it's graphic art, comic books, or whether it's the equivalent of comic books, mosaic floors in the synagogue. So in the ancient synagogues throughout the Galilee, we have mosaic floors that are gorgeous, beautiful mosaics. In the city of Sepphoris in the Galilee, we have uncovered large parts of the city. It was a city that had Jews, it had pagans. One beautiful house in Sepphoris, we don't know whether it was Jewish or pagan, has Aphrodite on the floor. But the synagogues, not just in Sepphoris, probably a half dozen synagogues, as you mentioned, have mosaics of the zodiac. All right, so the zodiac doesn't really have to be pagan. After all, we celebrate 12 months in the Jewish year. They're lunar months. If you have the sky and can see it, you can figure out the zodiac. But in the center of each of those synagogues, as you mentioned, there is a mosaic of Zeus Helios driving his quadriga, his four-horse chariot, across the sky. So some people say, all right, it's Helios, it's the sun. So they put it there as a representation of the sun going across the sky, just like they have the 12 months, the 4 seasons. We shouldn't interpret it as anything more than the sun personified. But we also see pictures where we might think that Zeus Helios is a representation of God. There's a very famous story already in the Mishnah, in the earliest rabbinic document we have, about the leader of the rabbinic community, Rabban Gamliel. And Rabban Gamliel, like any good Hellenist, and frankly like any good Jew from my era, he liked to go to the Schwitz every day. He would go to the bathhouse. And one day, a pagan, I'm guessing, his name is mentioned in the Mishnah, Proculus ben Philosophus, Proculus, a good Roman name, the son of the philosopher, said to Rabban Gamliel, hey, what are you doing in this bathhouse? There's a statue of Aphrodite here. There's a statue of a Roman Greek god. How can you pray here? How can you bathe here? And Gamliel, who's very, very witty, says, you've asked me a question of Jewish law, and I'm naked now in the bathhouse. I'll have to wait until we get dressed and go outside. So he puts the guy down. They finally get dressed. They go outside. And the guy comes back at him. He says, so what are you doing? Doesn't it say in your Torah you're not supposed to do this? And Gamliel says, listen, you think Aphrodite is a goddess here? You're standing naked in front of her. You guys are peeing. You wouldn't do that in your temple, would you? I can only conclude that the bathhouse is not there dedicated to the goddess Aphrodite. Quite the contrary. The Aphrodite statue is a statue. It adorns the bathhouse. And then he says, channeling Freud, sometimes art is just art, right? You don't have to overinterpret. There's a nice statue. I'm happy with it, but I don't see it as a goddess. That's the principle that Gamliel puts down in the Mishnah.
What that puts into my mind is at this time of year, some of the conversation that I hear about Christmas in America and how Jews should respond to it, because, there's this notion, a lot of people say, things like Christmas trees or Santa Claus or, whatever it might be, are just something that Jews should have, nothing to do with. A good Jew wouldn't, not bring it in your house, not bring your kids to sit on Santa's lap in the mall or whatever. And yet, I hear from a lot of Jews and from a lot of non-Jews, like these things, right, have nothing to do with religion. Yeah, maybe they had some religious origin, but for me, the Santa Claus in the mall has absolutely nothing to do with religion whatsoever. And once that becomes the case, in the same way that I think Rabbi Gamliel was describing Aphrodite, then why can't, in one case, Aphrodite be on our mosaic, and in another case, it's perfectly fine for Jews to go sit on Santa's lap in the mall. So how do you think about that as far as our times go and where our red lines should be, let's say?
Well, I personally, myself, I'm not a fan of Santa Claus. I don't think I never let my kids sit on Santa's lap. Maybe if there were a Hanukkah Claus, I might go for it.
But why, based on that story, is what, how is that different from that story?
Because Santa Claus is Saint Nicholas, and I think Santa Claus is inexorably tied to the Christian holiday Christmas. Christmas starts with the word Christ, Christ. On the other hand, Halloween, which also admittedly is hallowed evening, but nobody celebrates that as a Christian holiday. And the question then is, so do you let your kids trick or treat? Answer, I do. And my kids were happy trick or treating. I understand I have Jewish colleagues who say we don't need to trick or treat. And not only do we not need to trick or treat, but if you want to dress up in a costume, hello, there's Purim. So we have ours, they have theirs, but it doesn't mean that we should entirely avoid it.
We've mentioned Hanukkah a bit here and there, and I want to hone in more on it, both because it's that time of year, and also because I think it's just really emblematic of a lot of the most important questions that your book really addresses. And as I think about Hanukkah, we really have to confront this story of Hanukkah that we've internalized in a very big way of a story of separation from the rest of society, as the fight against Hellenism, which, as your book demonstrates, is not really the story. But do we look at your book and the knowledge that you're bringing to light and entirely reconfigure what we think Hanukkah means and signifies today, or can we maybe balance it such that we retain some of that story of Jewish distinctiveness, or do we entirely stick with that old story? What should we do with that?
What do we do with Hanukkah? I think there is always a battle in how we interpret, how much we assimilate, how much we stick just to a narrow Jewish identity. And I actually think Hanukkah is really emblematic of that battle within the Jewish psyche, within the Jewish community, because there's more than one story of Hanukkah. In rabbinic literature, in the entirety of the Talmud, there's maybe one folio dedicated to Hanukkah. The rabbis didn't care much for Hanukkah because they didn't care much for the Maccabees. Why not? Because by the time the rabbis came around, the Maccabees were completely corrupt. It had very little to do with assimilation and everything to do with buying and selling the high priesthood, which the rabbis obviously disapproved of. Because the rabbis disapproved of the Maccabees, they wanted to minimize the story of Hanukkah, and they did so in two ways. One, they suppressed the books of the Maccabees. Now, we have those books because the church preserved them. The church preserved them in what's called the Apocrypha, the Greek Bible, but they're not in the Hebrew Bible. The second thing the rabbis did was they re-emphasized the story of Hanukkah. The story of Hanukkah was not about a battle. The rabbis were not militants. In fact, if anything, they were a little pacifist. After the destruction of the temple in 70 and after the debacle of Bar Kokhba in 132 to 135, the rabbi said, we don't want war. What they talked about was the miracle of the oil. They kind of told the story about rededicating the temple. That's the word Hanukkah, dedication. And in rededicating the temple, we all know the story. They found the cruse of oil. It lasted 8 days. It's a miracle. So we told the story of the miracle of Hanukkah. I kind of prefer the story of the oil. Why? Because for me, the abiding lesson of the story of the oil of Hanukkah is that we as Jews are obligated to add light. We add a candle every night. Adding light is what it's about. And that light can be the light of Hellenism. It can be the light of a Western education. It can be the light of sitting down with your friends and learning Talmud once a week or every day. It can be the light of going to the synagogue. It can be the light of just breaking your teeth and learning the alphabet, but Jewish learning is not only the light that feeds our own Jewish souls, but it is also a light to the world. I think we like Hanukkah because it celebrates the shift in the year from darkness to light. We like Hanukkah in America because it gives us something to celebrate with our kids while our neighbors are celebrating Christmas. For all I know, we could be celebrating Diwali or Ramadan, and maybe we should be celebrating with our neighbors all of those things too. But Hanukkah, I think for them was a minor holiday. The rabbis told the story of the miracle of the 8 days of oil. But in the books of the Maccabees, when they explain why Hanukkah was 8 days, their analogy is actually Sukkot. That what the Hellenist Maccabees were doing was they were trying to find a way to celebrate their victories and their recapturing the temple. And the best way they knew how to do it was to do Sukkot in the wintertime, and that's what they did. So we have an 8-day festival. There's two versions of why it's an 8-day festival, and we can hold on to them both.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because Lex and I are working on a website with sort of alternative materials for Hanukkah, as we've done for Shavuot and the high holidays already. And we ultimately want to do for all the holidays. And one of the things that we've been knocking around as we've been talking it through is look, the reality is that most Jews celebrate Hanukkah. And that's probably going to stay around for, as long as we live in a country where everybody else is celebrating Christmas and people are going to want to have something else to do. And so now, having embraced the reality that Hanukkah is a major holiday in the experience of Jews, how could we actually turn it into a major holiday of Jewish meaning? One of the things that we've been playing around with is importing certain practices into Hanukkah from other holidays. So it's interesting that you're right, that the Maccabees created Hanukkah as a sort of Sukkot in the wintertime. And one of the ideas that we're thinking about is, can we bring the tradition of Ushpizin, where we invite somebody every night into the sukkah, could we bring that to the Hanukkah table where we light the menorah? Could every night we sort of bring a person to learn about and accompany and think about in terms of, especially since most Jews don't celebrate Sukkot, so they don't really have access to an experience like that. And something that you were saying earlier was making me think that, if Hanukkah is not either this utter rejection of the world around us, nor the utter embrace of the world around us, but actually sort of trying to live in that tension, then it strikes me that it might be interesting to imagine a Hanukkah Seder, where we would actually have some kind of symposium where we would be discussing that very question, and that Hanukkah could actually be this holiday where all Jews struggle with that question every year, as opposed to sort of reconciling it one way or the other and not really thinking about it.
I like what you say about having some Sukkot notions and the idea of Ushpizin, of inviting guests, because it's a beautiful mode of Jewish education. We can invite guests from the Jewish past, men and women who helped shape Judaism, whether Judaism from the Bible, Judaism from the Rabbinic era, Judaism from the Middle Ages, and it's a good educational mode that for each of the 8 nights of Hanukkah, we have some new guests in our home, to say the least, of actual guests in our home, inviting company to come light the candles with us, both Jewish and non-Jewish. So that I applaud. But I would point out that I think Passover is actually probably even more celebrated than Hanukkah. It is the most widely embraced Jewish holiday, and I think the reason is because you do it at home. Even Jews who don't belong to synagogues do some form of Passover. So I would keep the symposium on Passover and bring Sukkot to Hanukkah as it was in ancient days. I want to, caution us against the myth that we live by, that once upon a time, way back when, there was some pure thing called Judaism. Because my colleagues who do biblical scholarship are quick to point out that everything that we think is biblical Judaism also imbibed from surrounding cultures. And everything, my book shows, that we think is Rabbinic Judaism imbibed. In other words, there was never an era in Judaism that there was some rigid orthodoxy of pure Judaism. And the irony is, even now, the most rigid of the Orthodox who are doing what they think is some pure Judaism, in fact, are doing a Judaism that's an amalgam of many different things. Because we're a living religion, we're a breathing religion. Of course we engage with the surrounding culture. And how we engage with the surrounding culture determines who we will be going forward.
It seems that what you're describing is people who are living deeply grounded in the society are essentially rebuilding a new Judaism that in many ways mirrors the surrounding society, retains much, but also doesn't retain much. And I guess, that the question that I'm asking, for example, I love the language that Amichai Lalavi talks about in Lab Shul. He calls it God optional, right? And so, it strikes me that, maybe even just thinking about God's place, that in the temple, right, God is very immanent, and Yitzhak Greenberg talks about this, and it's almost literally fed by the sacrifices. In Rabbinic Judaism, we move to a God who is more distant, and there's prayer takes a greater point, but so does study. And you point out that study of Torah very much maps onto the Greco-Roman tradition of studying text, of studying Homer. If perhaps post-Holocaust, post-Enlightenment, we're moving to a world in which Jews see it as something along the lines of, at the very least, God optional, wouldn't that put pressure on us to say, well, how do we rebuild this religion in yet another way, that and would the starting position not be some version of understanding what the world around us is like, analogous to that time that the world around them was like the Greco-Roman tradition? And now we have, maybe it's the Western tradition, maybe it's the Eastern tradition, maybe it's the post-60s fusion of the Western and Eastern tradition in America that's ultimately the fertile ground. And then how do we decide what to keep and what to let go of?
I think you've presented us with the possibility of an either-or, and that there's enormous tension between other and us. And what I'd like to suggest is that it's yes, both. That to make such a sharp distinction is to miss the message of Genesis, which is our God, the one God, the only God, is the God of all humanity. And that the world we share is a world where we share a common ancestor, or ancestors, Adam and Eve, and that our mode of worship may be different, but that we see the image of God in our fellow human being. But that doesn't stop us from the obligation. It doesn't preclude us from having an obligation to learn our rich Jewish past. So if I'm teaching in Aphrodite and the Rabbis that our Jewish past is a marriage of Hellenism and biblical Judaism, what I'm saying is our Jewish past is like our Jewish present. It is a place that embraces both worlds and tries to make them one. But in order to do that, you got to know what you're embracing. That means you have to learn Jewish texts. You have to learn Jewish tradition. Minimally, you have to read my book. But it's meant to be a start. There are many doors that still have to be open.
So to my mind, you are making a very radical statement in your book, which is that Judaism was transformed so profoundly, so deeply in that transition. And many of the ways in which it was profound so deeply were the sort of restructuring around principles that were deeply held principles by the greater society around the Jews in which they lived. And in a way, I'm asking in our time, option number one is we haven't experienced a dislocation as serious as the destruction of the Second Temple, and therefore we don't have to make a move that is quite so radical. That's possibility number one. And possibility number two is that we have experienced a dislocation that is so radical, that's analogous to that. And then my question is then what is the radical statement that will be said about us in 1,000 years, about this period, right? That a move was made that was such an utter transformation of Judaism that there's some new principle that has become perhaps the most important, the most central. And of course, we can't know now what they're going to say in 1,000 years. But as we think about, if we are, in a sense, the generation of the early rabbis, then the question is sort of what moves should we be considering making that are as radical as those early rabbis who said the study of Torah is the most basic principle of Judaism?
So let me begin by stating my credo. I'm a conservative rabbi, and the reason we use the term conservative is we believe in conserving the past. I think, Dan, you're right that there has been a dislocation 70 years ago with the Holocaust, and an entire way of life was rudely brought to an end, much as the destruction of the temple rudely brought to an end the cult of Israelite religion. And then from the ashes of the temple arose, if you will, I'll use a good Hellenistic trope, the phoenix of Rabbinic Judaism. And we have to wonder now, what is going to arise from the destruction that was wrought in the Holocaust? And I think one of the things we see is that European Jewry was almost irreparably damaged, and Jewry arose in two other centers. One is the United States, and we have and are continuing to be in the process of recreating our own version of Judaism. And the second is in the state of Israel, Zionism. So for a long time in America, we talked about our identity in terms of Zionism and the Holocaust. And only in the last 20, 30 years have we begun to realize that we have an American identity, not rooted to Europe, not rooted to Israel, but rooted to Jewish learning. So that one of the ways we identify, and one of the things we're profoundly doing, is in a way recreating the rabbinic moment by Jewish learning. And whether it's Jewish learning sitting over something as quaint as a book, or Jewish learning like my rabbinical students do, they all either open their phones or open their pads, and suddenly the text is there before them. We are committed to new forms of Jewish learning, even a podcast.
Not to disagree with it, but to raise the question of, can we really say that today yet, right? Meaning that if you would have asked a rabbinic Jew in, the time of the Mishnah, they would say, the center of our Jewish world is the Galilee, and we also have a center in Rome, but it turned out that for various reasons, the center in the Galilee didn't make it, and that the Judaism that we know and love was a Judaism that had an important time of creation in the land of Israel, both in the pre-rabbinic and in the rabbinic period, but its ultimate flowering, its ultimate development happened in the America of its day. And so I wonder about this question of, it's obviously true what you said, that there are two important centers of Jewish development. And I think that Zionism is the easier one, because it's very clear how Zionism, in particular secular Zionism, is a new Judaism based on a new set of principles in all sorts of ways. I think it's not yet clear how American Judaism is or could be as profoundly new as a form of Judaism as secular Zionism was. And that's the question that I'm really struggling with, is this question of, yes, it may or may not be that in the long run of history, both groups will make it and will have an ongoing relationship with one another. But even just as a thought experiment, what if it turns out that that is not the case? And I'm wondering still what the American Judaism would look like that was as profoundly American as Rabbinic Judaism was, in your argument, profoundly Greco-Roman, which I bought, I accepted that.
I think we're already at that moment that American Judaism has a unique face in Jewish history. And I would just offer as a very simple but to me very obvious example of how American Judaism is different than certainly the previous 500 years, but possibly the last 3,000 years, is that the American ethos of feminism, the American ethos of the equality of women, has certainly penetrated Judaism in wildly and wonderfully positive ways. I'm at the Jewish Theological Seminary. We were later to the game than our Reform colleagues, but having been here at JTS for 45 years, I can happily celebrate on a daily basis the fact that we have women rabbis, that I have women rabbinical students, that I have women colleagues on the Talmud faculty. All of that has served us incredibly well. But that's a really new face for Judaism in the last 500 or 1,000 years. And that is a direct result of American Judaism.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think is important to convey?
I would say to you who are doing these podcasts that I would include podcasts as part of the vehicle for Jewish learning and for also bringing God's presence, the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit among us. If we're going to include psalms and we're going to include the instrumentation, the musicians who played in the temple, we should include you guys who are doing podcasts as well. And your listeners should never, ever lose sight of the fact that listening to a podcast, which sometimes can be a very passive activity, you put on your headphones, you drive, you're on the exercise machine, whatever it is also a profoundly Jewish experience. And I hope that as they listen, they celebrate their Jewish identity.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Burton Visotzky. It's great to have you on. It's a real treat and a real honor.
And thank you so much for featuring Aphrodite and the Rabbis. I'm very, very appreciative.
It's been a real pleasure for us to have Burton Visotzky on the show to talk about his book, Aphrodite and the Rabbis. We hope that you'll purchase it. It's available on Amazon, and there's a link to it on our website in the show notes for this episode. We want to close our show today out by encouraging you to be in touch with us, the hosts, Dan and Lex, and there are a few ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can head to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. Third, you can send us emails at dan@nextjewishfuture.org or lex@nextjewishfuture.org. And last but not least, we always encourage our listeners to support us. And there are a couple ways to do that, all of which can be found at the link JudaismUnbound.com/donate. We also want to let you know that there is an initiative that we're doing for Hanukkah Unbound, that spotlights ways that you can make this holiday really meaningful and interesting for your family, for you, for whoever you want to share it with. And you can find that at JudaismUnbound.com. Thanks again for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.